Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Race Matters, a multidisciplinary exploration of race in America. I don't know about how you feel. I think I might have a guess, Dr. Carroll. I'm really glad to be back in our normal format this week as much as I enjoyed last week. I think I sprouted one or two more gray hairs trying to force.
Definitely something. Yeah, it's great to be back in this format. I'm feeling much more comfortable with this. So.
Yes. But it was valuable, and I appreciated the willingness of our professor last week, Dr. Tunayo Guz, and our guests to kind of roll with it and to try something new with us. So really, all thanks to them, and our apologies for all awkwardness. And thank you for giving us the opportunity to learn how to do this better, because we're going to try again, not necessarily a hybrid event next time, but we will have another opportunity toward the very end of the semester to share another meal together. So hopefully that one will go better, right?
Yes.
So this evening, as usual, we will have the opportunity to hear from our guest professor for this week, Dr. Leslie Mckesson. She's going to speak with us for a few minutes to get us started. And then we're going to ask and invite questions from you, our class. You are what makes this format especially good, is the interaction that we're able to share with you, with our guests here this evening. To respect your time, we will end right at 7 o'clock. So we might not get to all of your questions, but we'll make our best effort to do so. We'll also make this session available tomorrow on YouTube and on our Canvas page.
And I think it's now my turn to introduce our guest instructor for today, Dr. Leslie Mckesson. I'm so grateful that you agreed to be with us today. And I'll just tell you a little bit about Dr. Mckesson. She is a retired community college educator and administrator. She combines her career experience, family history, and academic research to facilitate discussions around race and equity. Mckesson's work spans her career, with some of her current roles including Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for the Industrial Commons, Commissioner for the North Carolina African American Heritage Commission, immediate past President of the Historic Burke Foundation, and member of the North Carolina Society. In addition, she serves as adjunct faculty of education with Appalachian State University and has taught graduate leadership studies at Lenoir-Rhyne. She completed her undergraduate degree at UNC Chapel Hill and her graduate studies at Appalachian State University. An author and public speaker, Mckesson has received numerous awards and distinctions. She is married with 4 adult children and 14 grandchildren. Welcome, Dr. Mckesson.
Thank you, Dr. Carroll, Dr. Taylor, Dr. Simmons, Dr. Ramírez. It's truly an honor for me to be with this group of people whom I respect so highly this evening. And I won't spend a lot of time because I'm hoping there will be a lot of wonderful questions that will come from our participants out there in cyberspace. But I will start off just by trying to bring everyone's attention to the weight of education.
And wait right there while you say wait.
Okay, wait, another kind of wait, right?
Because I'm so excited.
Only because we want to make sure that before we get into it, we want to introduce Dr. Simmons and Dr. Ramírez. So
very good.
I'm going to get back to that wait you were talking about.
Okay.
I'm going to wait with bated breath. But we get a twofer tonight, y'all. Not only do we get Dr. Mckesson, but we get 2 excellent guests from our community, including Dr. JuanEs Ramírez, who is the state representative for Spanish services at the College Foundation of North Carolina. Dr. Ramírez graduated from LRU. So here we have another bear with us with a Bachelor of Arts in International Relations and Modern Languages, a Master of Science in Strategic Leadership from Mountain State University, and he also holds an Educational Specialist and Doctorate degree in Higher Education Leadership and Administration from App State. Dr. Ramírez has served in nonprofits, banking, and higher education in several capacities, teaching, consulting, program development, and leadership. In addition to his passion for learning and education, Dr. Ramírez cherishes time with his family and loves to travel. As a leader in his community, he's engaged in a variety of leadership opportunities. And the list before me is long. We are very fortunate to have him here with us, as we are to have Dr. Felicia Simmons, who is from Lenore. So not a bear, but close enough, we'll claim you. She's married to Monte Simmons, who's a physical education teacher and head football coach for West Caldwell High School. And Dr. Simmons is a mother of 3 children, Monte Jr., Felice. Am I pronouncing that correctly? I forgot to ask you before, Felice and Micah. She is a graduate of West Caldwell High School and Winston-Salem State University, where she received her BS. Dr. Simmons is also a graduate of Gardner-Webb University, where she obtained a master's in school administration and her doctoral degree in educational leadership. Dr. Simmons is most known for being employed in the education profession. She has received or served in numerous capacities in education from pre-K to 12th grade. She has a passion for students and has served as a teacher, an assistant principal, a principal in elementary, middle, and high schools. And most recently, she is a vice president at the Catawba Valley Community College. So congratulations on that recent appointment. You might know her if you read the Hickory Daily Record. She, just a couple of weeks ago, was one of our notable neighbors. So welcome to Dr. Simmons and Dr. Ramírez. And now that we've waited, will you favor us by continuing to talk about the weight of education, Dr. Mckesson?
Thank you. So now that the wait for that is over, I had to do that. I just had to do that. Going back to what my opening comment was going to be, I'd just like for all of us to consider the weight, W-E-I-G-H-T, of education in American society, not only American society, but throughout the world. Education is very much a way in which our cultures are transmitted. We teach our beliefs through education. Our education systems celebrate holidays and they tell students what's important. They tell students what is proper and what's improper. So they mediate and mitigate our behaviors. So education is a bedrock of any society. And I think it's something that needs to be discussed and discussed more broadly. Education can be used and often has been used to train people for specific roles in society. So while we often think of education as the great equalizer, there are some realities that suggest that education may sometimes do a little something different. So those are just things I'd like for you to keep in mind as we go through our discussion tonight. Mm-hmm. And that's it.
That's it. No more waiting.
That's it. No more waiting. The wait is over.
All right. Well, let's just dive into talking about all this. And, I have to do this, but when you talk about the wait, it makes me think about, I'm teaching this semester a course called African Americans in Education. And we're pretty much looking at the history of African American education and some of the debates, surrounding education and African Americans over time. And as I prepared for that course, I felt a weight. I felt a weight because it's the first time this course, to my knowledge, has ever been taught at this university, or a course like it where we're looking at just the history of African Americans in education. And so I recognize that the students who are signing up for this course could have never had access to this information if I didn't choose to teach it, or if someone else didn't choose to teach it. And so as I prepared, I realized that this is a part of a calling. This is a part of, the necessity to pass down knowledge and information. And so I think about something that you said in your lecture, where you said that, African-American parents and educators, they saw the need to establish schools and education for Black students after the war, not just about reading and writing, but it was more about really opening up doors and of opportunities for them, for, future students. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about just a philosophy of education for freedom. Are we getting education for freedom? Do we need freedom in order to get education? And what type of legacy are we trying to pass down to future generations of students?
I think that's a great question, and almost a chicken versus egg type question. The truth is that in the early history of African Americans and Africans in America, one of the first things that happened to establish this institution called slavery was that the right to learn, the right to be literate, was taken away, because there was I think, a clear understanding that there's a link and a connection between education, literacy, and citizenship. So very much by taking away a people group's ability to be educated and their opportunities to be educated, I think that was very much a part of the success of enslaving people. So you take away that freedom to be educated, and other freedoms are going to kind of like dominoes fall along behind that. And to kind of flip the analogy, you need to have freedom in order to be educated. I think it speaks to both ends of that. Education in order to attain freedom is necessary because an informed citizenship, an informed citizenry is required. You have to have some degree of education and literacy to participate in the democratic project. But at the same time, you have to be free to receive that education. And that was definitely stripped away from a people group early in American history.
Right, and let me just add to that, because I think also in your lecture, you talked about literacy being tied to a student's sense of worth and just self-value. And I like to kind of unpack that a little bit and, think about that in relation to the intentional withholding of education and how that impacts the self-worth.
Yes, very much so. And there's an interesting dynamic going on with that now in contemporary society that could bear some digging into. But in the post-slavery days, the tie between education and self-worth was very strong and very clear. You just think about what society was like then. If you could read, if you could write yourself a pass that would allow you to travel. You could do things that would give you freedoms that people who were illiterate would not have. So I think back in those days, there was a much clearer and more immediate tie between literacy or being educated and freedom, perhaps, than what we see now. But there was very much a sense of self-worth that went along with being able to read, being able to write, because it meant that to some extent you had more control over your life, your destiny, where you could travel. Like the example that I gave, you could write yourself a pass to go to the next plantation to visit a relative. So there was a clear and obvious tie between literacy and self-worth, particularly in the early days. And even after slavery, when you entered into the early Jim Crow days, when Blacks were trying to establish themselves as free citizens, literacy was critical. Poll taxes, literacy tests before you could vote. Very basic elements of our rights as citizens were granted or withheld to us or from us based on our ability to demonstrate some level of education and understanding. Fairly, unfairly, but it was done.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that kind of connects to the need for historically Black colleges and universities. And I think about how you point out in your lecture that those universities were necessary in order for Blacks to just have a proud history and legacy. And so I kind of want to kind of pose this to both you and Dr. Simmons. For you, you know, as a graduate of a PWI, and I too, a graduate of a PWI, predominantly white institution, for those who don't know. And particularly for me, I have always felt something was missing from my educational experience, my identity development, particularly when I encounter people from HBCUs, and there's something different about them. And they have something that I don't have. And so I'm just thinking, can you all speak to how the HBCU might impact identity development for Black students, and also how the PWI, what impact that has on identity development for the students who go to predominantly white institutions? So either one of you can jump in on that.
I'm going to ask Dr. Simmons to take that because I know she can run with it. But I just want to say, Dr. Carroll, I totally identify with what you said, because to this day, I feel that there's something that I missed in my education by not attending an HBCU. I really do. So, Dr. Simmons.
Well, I'm going to start. Yes, I am a product of an HBCU, Winston-Salem State. It is a sense of pride in any person that you speak with that attended an HBCU, which is a historically Black college and university. You will see them light up. It doesn't matter where, when, or what. It is because there's something about the atmosphere. And I will go back when I was growing up in a rural area. I was the only one, or maybe 3 or 4 in classes. It says something to see people like you wanting the same goals, or having the same goals that you have, learning about the rich culture and history that you have. I know the first question was related to freedom. And we look at what's going on in education right now when it comes to freedom. There was an adoption of a new social studies standard that was out for years that teachers had privy to. However, they were under the gun when they were implemented, because they were talking about the history of our Black and brown kids. And that includes Hispanic. They talked about equity, about people that are different and diverse. And when you talk about equity, it's not just ethnicity, it's everything. And so to hear freedom, we still don't have freedom in the education system to teach about the history and the richness of the history of Black and brown kids. There's more to history than Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King. There was a little girl that made history, that refused to give up her seat before Rosa Parks. And so therefore, it's that history, it's that freedom that you receive from an HBC university, of people that look like you. And it's okay to be you. It's okay to wear your hair the way you want to wear it. It's okay for you to look a certain way. It embraces your culture. And that's what a product of an HBCU brings. It brings that we are one, we belong. We belong in America. We belong, we feel each other's pain. The systemic oppression that some of us go through, it's okay to talk about it. So that's what the HBCU brings. I'm sorry, I probably took up too much time, but.
No. That was great. I think when HBCs were first established, there was definitely just the goal of racial uplift, right? We needed to uplift the race and educate the race and all of that. Today, though, some may say, okay, are HBCUs, still relevant, particularly if we have a goal of trying to, be more unified across racial lines and ethnicity lines. You know, should we be looking at different types of institutions for today? Do we still need the historically Black college and university?
Yes, it is a great need for HBCUs to still be operating because, like I talked about myself, there are students that are coming from rural areas that don't even find themselves until they get to an HBCU because they're put in the back. And in an HBCU, sometimes they are pushed towards the front. They see teachers that look like them. They see administrators that look like them. And that is clear. It's evident that there is success behind that. So it is important. But I will say, no matter if it is an HBCU or a PWI, you have to go where you feel like that you can establish your goals and your dreams. For me, it was an HBCU because I wanted to be the majority and not the minority. Some people may not feel that way. Some people may be used to seeing a lot of their race and may want to go to a PWI2 experience. My son got the best of both worlds. He did his bachelor's at an HBCU and then his master's at a PWI. Now, I'm not going to say which one he loves the best because I'm not going to do that. But he had the best of both worlds. But my kids have realized and seen that culturalism that my husband and I bring from HBCUs to where both of my children so far have attended HBCUs. And you can look at the NFL now, or these students coming out of high school that are picking HBCUs over another college. So HBCUs are relevant because we are embracing our culture. And that's what anyone should do, is embrace your culture.
Mm-hmm. On that point, if I could just throw in, Dr. Simmons, there's also another category of higher education that you don't hear as much about, but it is very much a part of the American landscape, and that's the HSI, or the Hispanic Serving Institute. We don't have nearly as many of those in the country as we do the HBCUs, but Dr. Ramírez, did you want to throw anything in there about HSIs?
Yeah, so whenever you guys were thinking about the historically Black schools, I was thinking about how difficult it is to navigate those processes, especially if you're a newcomer. And I was putting myself in those shoes and just remembering how much I struggle with my whole identity. And what I have seen from students and just working with students is that all of us are bringing to the different spaces a little backpack, right? And we all are going to need different things at different times. So there are times where I would have loved to connect with people that I understood my struggles, my traumas, my language, that I could sit down and speak with and feel comfortable doing that. And you guys mentioned that many of you did not have that. And actually that's part of the reason why I decided to move into all levels of higher education, just seeking that answer of how I feel and not having the language that I needed. So books and theory and colleagues became that help that I needed. But I think there is something about finding a safe space in which can provide what you may need at different times. And I'm a big advocate for us to have those safe spaces, whether we call them HBCU or HSI or PWI or my home or a cafeteria or my classroom or an office. So I'm a big advocate for that. And I think that we need people, we need to have representation of people that are able to provide all of that in all different settings. Because I think that that's really what, you know, having people like mine that might have a similar cultural may provide that for the students. So I'm a big advocate of having people representing all communities in all places. So I don't know if that answered your question, but I think that's kind of where I'm going to leave it.
Yeah, I think that's great.
Sorry,
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Dr. Newton.
I was going to say, I have a feeling that we're gonna circle back to the kinds of services that HSIs can offer their students, in particular, many educational barriers in that realm. But there's a question from the Q&A, since we're talking about HSIs and HBCUs. Jane Cantwell wonders, so she points out that some white students and employees have been suing HBCUs for discrimination. What's your take?
Well, I feel if anyone has been discriminated against, then you have the right to speak out. But discrimination goes on in all organizations. So that is my take when it comes to that. If anyone has been discriminated against or feels like they have been discriminated against, then you have that right to find whatever is necessary to support and assist.
I answered a tiny different perspective. So by default, when we concentrate on something, we silence something else. And I think that, and I can tell you very specifically with Spanish services, I serve Spanish speakers across the state. And by that reason, I have to not attend other things that does not move the needle forward specifically for that group. So I think that when we give the platform for something, there's something else that we silence or we leave out. And so I think that sometimes things like that are able to happen and can happen because of that. The focus, the frame, Dr. Lenson mentioned, like the framework, the lenses in which we look at information, we're gonna be looking at it from that specific lens.
Can I just jump in here? And Dr. Newton, I know that you're gonna follow up with something, but I wanna interrogate this a little more, because what I'm hearing is, before the question about white people suing HBCUs for discrimination, there was a big discussion about how important HBCUs were for identity development. And prior to that, there was discussion about the reason there needed to be this emphasis on identity development, because for hundreds and hundreds of years, there was a belittling of identity, right? There was you're not valuable, you don't have worth, you're intellectually inferior, and so are your descendants. And so just to go back up, so we have that, so, well, now we're free, we're gonna have HBCUs, it's gonna help with uplifting the race and, having some positive identity development. We're gonna have HSIs and just helping to, make up for really what was lost. And that kind of gets into the whole education debt. So I just think that the question is about, is there still a need for this work on the thinking of people and their own self-worth and what they think about them? And so while some groups may be silenced while there's focus on another group, I think that's where the tension is. Ultimately, we want to get to a point where everybody can just be and nobody feels slighted and everyone feels like they're valuable and worthy. But obviously, if we're having this discussion, it seems that we're not exactly there yet. And I think, Dr. Newton, you were going to follow up with some more on that.
Speaking of getting there,
yeah.
I'm so glad we're talking about HSIs. Dr. Ramírez, political issues like DACA, immigration laws, the immigration ban, the impacts of deportation on Latinx families, and many, many other issues. What are some of the ways that HSIs are especially situated to kind of meet those needs of students? And how does race intersect with education for the Latinx experience of education, especially higher education?
So I'm going to have to move that to North Carolina context, where we don't necessarily have any declare HSI. We have some institutions that are getting very near. And so that's really not the situation here in North Carolina. But speaking specifically with those institutions that have a lot of Hispanic, Latinos, or Latinx individuals, one of the best practices has been having a place where they feel comfortable. I'm thinking specifically Lenore Community College, where they have the Centro Hispano or Centro Latino within the community college system. And I think that that's a great move. Specifically talking about DACA and undocumented students, those are groups that continue to be in a disadvantage here in the state. As many of you guys know, they do not qualify for state or financial aid. State or federal financial aid. They are in the hands of institutional scholarships or other funding. So I think that they're really struggling right now. They are kind of like the new kids on the block, so that they're the ones that having a difficult time here. But so I do wanna, like, just thinking about having that place where they feel they belong and having a place where they feel welcome, understood. It's crucial. And so I'm a big advocate for us. And if in North Carolina, we would have, Hispanic serving institutions, I think that many of our students will feel good and would go there because they do need the identity development or seeing people that look like them and all of that. So I'm a big proponent for that. So I just don't know if North Carolina might be a great example of that. I think what we can do is learn from our friends from Texas and California that have done this longer than we have. And they seem to, we seem to learn best practices from them. So we are learning. We're in the baby stages learning from them.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you, Dr. Ramírez. I want to kind of pivot a little bit and talk about, get into this whole achievement gap versus education debt and, what we can do about that. And I want to call some attention to some statistics from the Calling in the Courage video. In that video, it was cited that the average 12th grade African-American student in this study could read no better than the average 4th grade white student. I'll just say that again. The average 12th grade African-American student from this study could read no better than the average 4th grade white student. That's a big gap. And we see that gap. I mean, you can even look at just the achievement gap statistics here in Hickory. I mean, look nationally and you'll see these achievement gap statistics. And so I wanted to kind of throw this to you, Dr. Simmons. You've held various roles and have led on all levels, from classroom teacher to administrator, district level personnel, and even more. What are your thoughts on statistics like these? And did you see these types of disparities in your own experiences?
I did see that because most of the schools that I served as a leader at was your low performing and underserved students. However, there is an expectation of staff of the empathy for the students, of their backgrounds, and it's also holding everyone accountable. When I say holding everyone accountable, it doesn't stop with the students, but it's also the faculty, the staff, the parents, getting a mind shift, because some of the employees used to say, well, they won't come out. Then you find a way to make people feel welcome so it's not as intimidating. And every school I was at went from either below growth, no growth, to high performing. And it's because you create a spirit of, we can do this. We are important. Students need to feel important. There is a way culturally that you speak to students, that you respect students. And that doesn't say allow students to get away with anything, because I held them accountable as well, and teachers did too. But it was a sense of belonging. I keep going back to a sense of belonging. And you also, it's not about a lot of funding. It's about the resources that you have and creating processes and really looking at the data to see where students have those gaps. Is it in reading? If so, then what is it? Is it the phonetics? What is it about? Getting them an understanding of the lingo of the state assessments that they have, creating resources after school, during school. If you couldn't get them in the afternoon, then you do it during lunchtime, that where it's not felt that they were getting punished, but that they were having fun and getting help. It's more than sit and get. It's interactive. It's a conversation. It's putting them, if you have students that have IEPs or ADHD, it's moving. It's movement in the classroom, and that's creating centers for them to move about in the levels that they are, so that the teacher is focusing on not the whole group, but individual needs for each group of students. So, and it takes leaders being in the trenches. It takes leaders. You know, I was at almost every game. I was at different events. They need to see educators that are not just there to be behind a desk, but are continuously interacting, talking to them. Students will perform and do what you ask them to if they understand that you care for them. Mm-hmm. And that's the key, is developing processes. Not a lot of funding, because you can have a lot of funding and it go down the drain, but creating those processes that assist and support the students on an individual level.
I think it's very interesting that kind of your main points deal with more of the affective and the social emotional issues surrounding education. I didn't hear you say anything about, let's sit down and write this essay, although I know you probably wrote some essays and did all that, but you focused on them belonging and just, a sense of community. And so I wonder, when we think about closing opportunity gaps, what are other ways we can really focus on those social emotional needs and the affective? And that's for any of you all, when we're just looking at closing opportunities to learn.
I was going to mention that one of the sentiments that I had since arriving here to the United States, and I keep hearing it from students, and I don't know how much you guys feel this too, but is that sentiment of always having to catch up, always feeling behind peers, regardless of what you do. And when I was reading certain reports here in North Carolina, it confirmed that these long standings are, have been part of the culture here in North Carolina, not having access to ethnically and racially matched teachers, having SATs and ACTs that doesn't ask any questions about your culture. And so having difficulties finding daycare for your children or schooling for your kids where they have, bilingual programs and things like that. So I remember just the catching up, and I still feel that regardless of what I do, I still feel behind. I feel very behind. And I think that that's something important that we have to explore. But I think this second piece too comes from that deficit view that we a lot of times don't put high goals for our students, and we might make them I don't know. There's something about just expecting the best for the student regardless. I was having a conversation with some people yesterday, and they didn't know that they were not going to go to college. Like that was not even in their vocabulary, because their parents expected the maximum from them. So they had no choice. Like they were going to go to college regardless, because that's what their parents put in them. And the whole thing about just switching the deficit view to a culturally wealth, where we pick the best from the culture, the language, the role of parents in the culture. So all of those things I think can be helpful just to move that needle in educational attainment.
I agree. And I think You know, a couple of things that Dr. Ramírez said just kind of jumped out with the comment that I was going to make. The optics of representation. You know, just for a student to be able to walk into a classroom and see a person of authority, who's a faculty member or an administrator who looks like them, you know, they may not be saying to themselves literally, oh, yay, a Hispanic person, a Black person, but it registers with them. It gives them a sense of what they can be. And if this person was able to accomplish this, well, you know what? I can probably do that too. And the second factor is expectations, because so often expectations for children of color have been deflated. They've been pushed down. Well, this kid's from the ghetto, this kid's from a low income area, you know, urban children, as we like to call them these days. And educators have kind of diminished their expectations for those children because of their communities or because of their family dynamics or demographics. And they should actually be doing the opposite, you know, and finding the ways, like that meme, the equity meme kind of depicted, finding ways that you can give that kid the extra box to stand on. So that's why I like so much about what Dr. Simmons said, because the examples that she gave were examples of equitable approaches. These are the ways that you become a part of students' lives. And I think this is what used to happen more so in schools before desegregation happened in the first place, because Black teachers like my mother, if she had gotten a job in Greensboro, she'd have had to go live with a family in Greensboro. You know, that's what they did. They became part of the households and the communities. So they were really invested in their families. And some of that, I think, was lost when there was the transition to a desegregated system, which worked a completely different way. But that's not to say that those benefits could not have been captured and somehow added to the experience that became desegregation. It just didn't happen because the ways that Black folks did education were not viewed as the right way to do them, and they were set aside.
Right. And Dr. Mckesson, it's funny that you say that, because Brown versus Board of Education was meant to be a good thing. However, when we did desegregate schools, you had administrators that were into, when they went to another school, they were a custodian now. So yes. Therefore the respect that they had, which is not, there's nothing wrong with anyone being employed as a custodian, but to go from the leader of the school and a community figure to a custodial, where now they see that that person answers to numerous people, that diminished the role of a lot of our African-American educators. And so something that was meant for good, when we talk about freedom, it turned out diminishing our higher leadership roles.
Yeah. In Burke County, a lot of the African-American teachers after, when desegregation took place, just plain lost their jobs. They were no longer educators and they had to go into other fields. I spoke with someone yesterday who was talking to me about a school in Lenore called District 9, that when desegregation occurred, one of the persons who was the principal there, to your example, Dr. Simmons, the person who was the principal there ended up teaching driver's education, which is a worthy avocation, but he was a principal before desegregation. And then he ended up not even teaching an academic discipline, but teaching driver's education. So those things happened all the time.
The idea of these unintended consequences of policies like that, it's such an interesting thing to explore. So Karen Dickerson has pointed out that our conversation about education, and Dr. Mckesson, the way that you talk about debt, this education debt, it very strongly echoes what we learned last week about economic disparities. One thing we didn't get to talk about that I really wanted to last week was the idea of reparations as one type of a policy that can sometimes maybe potentially help. And it reminds me of other types of policies that we've attempted in the educational system. So something like affirmative action, a policy that's intended to try to help. And I'm wondering what you think. Are there sometimes unintended negative consequences of some policies, just like desegregation is a good thing, but it caused these negative outcomes? So you all talked about interpersonal approaches to overcoming educational disparities when Dr. Carroll asked you before. Is there a reason for that? Can we address it through policy?
I think we should try to address it through policy, recognizing that whatever we do is going to have some unintended consequences. Like Dr. Ramírez said, when you privilege one thing, you're automatically silencing others. Mm-hmm. So that's an expectation. And when there's a policy approach to something, people need to expect that. They need to expect that at some level, you've got this pie, and this pie has this amount in it. So if you want to redistribute what's in this pie, that means somebody is not going to be getting as big a piece as they had before. And that's where I think people don't want to make the sacrifice. They want the change to come without having to experience any kind of personal loss. And the idea that you mentioned of affirmative action, Dr. Taylor, I think is an example of something that we could, if we wanted to, kind of look at through a lens of reparations, because I think it was intended, it had that heart. And when you think about how it all played out, the biggest beneficiaries of affirmative action turned out to be white women. Who knew? Who would have ever guessed that would be the group that would benefit most from a public policy that was intended to rectify some racial wrongs from the past. But at the same time that happened, at the same time that white women were the primary beneficiaries, affirmative action is said to have led to a large, significant increase in the Black middle class. So at the same time that you can say, well, it did some things we didn't expect it to do, but on the other hand, it did play a positive role in increasing the number of Blacks who could attain that middle class.
Yeah, that's a really nice example of like that kind of balance between doing our best and kind of living with consequences. And I think your idea about like the pie, I think everyone hopes that just maybe the pie will get bigger. No one has to give up anything. But one of the things that Karen Dickerson in the comments here was talking about was the model of funding schools through property taxes as maybe an example of kind of what you're talking about in that pie and the discomfort that can be felt if you have a lot, then equality sounds great.
Yes.
But that's not equity. That's not going to even out the boxes. It's going to hurt maybe to even out the boxes. Do you think that's fair to say, Dr. Mckesson?
Could you say that again? You went out just a little bit.
Will it hurt to make the boxes equitable?
To make them, what was the last word?
To make the boxes in the baseball game mean?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Is there sacrifice involved?
I think at some point there has to be. At some point there has to be. And that is the core of the problem. If you have a situation where you have one group who has more than enough and who is in a position perhaps to sacrifice somewhat, but is unwilling to do that so that there can be an uplift of another group, that's where the rub comes in. You know, you can, maybe one day, I think the example of the little kids standing in front of the barrier to Dr. Taylor's comment, if you were able to just keep adding boxes, you know, eventually, maybe by the time that little kid gets 3 boxes, they'll be able to see over the barrier. But by that point, the biggest kid's going to be way, 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 way up here, going to have just like this eagle eye view, and the inequities are still perpetuated. Maybe the smaller child now has some degree of access to the playing field, whatever they're aiming for, but there's still a great disparity there. And at some point, I think society will try to address, or want to address in some way, these disparities. Right now, there's such that article that I included about the educational debt just talks about how much there is, to use that image, how much of a barrier there still is, that the kids who are, you know, the children of color just can't see over that barrier. It's not a matter now of them being able to see a little better over the barrier. It's a matter of getting to a point where you can see over the barrier.
And I think it kind of speaks to what you said, Dr. Ramírez. You're always feeling like you're catching up. You know, will it ever just be, you know, everyone's at the same, you know, level playing field? But I'm glad you brought up the article about the education debt, Dr. Mckesson, because I'm thinking that's just what we're talking about. And when we talk about, will there be sacrifices, and are those sacrifices fair if some have to sacrifice? And I think about how in Latson Billings' article, she discusses numerous debts that have resulted in an achievement gap. And, you know, she says, you know, it's not the achievement gap that's the issue, but it's the education debt. Because so much debt from education that has been taken away from not even being allowed to be educated, that has caused these outcomes of an achievement gap. And she speaks about one of the debts is, I think, a moral debt. And that, you know, we have a moral duty to somehow level this playing field. And I think level of playing field, I don't know if that's just the right term, because we're just talking about equity. We're just talking about giving everybody a fair shot, in a sense. But I know when we talk about that in my classrooms, what comes up in the discussion is, well, how is that my responsibility? You know, I didn't create the debt. I don't owe that debt. I had nothing to do with that. And so it's kind of like, whose responsibility is it? And I know that, you know, many of the, you know, leaders from previous times, you know, the Du Boises and those that followed would say, well, yeah, it's our responsibility. You know, you think about Du Bois and the whole talented 10, there needs to be some people who are going to kind of take up the mantle and keep going. But I think we're running out of time, and there's a question we definitely want to get to. And Taylor is prompting me like, don't forget that question. And that question has to do with critical race theory. Let's see. Okay, here it is. In the, I believe it was in the video, the Calling and Courage video, there's a quote, and it says, you know, education is the first legal structure in which America began to dismantle segregation, you know, pretty much with Brown versus Board overturning Plessy versus Ferguson. And so I think that's such an important observation that really reflects the power of education to just create impactful change. So I just wanted to throw out there, like, how do you all feel the current critical race theory in schools debate is impacting the continued fight for educational equity? I
could go on forever about that one, so I'll defer and let someone else go first.
And and I'll just do a follow-up and maybe you can see which one of these questions you think you can speak to. One is the current debate on CRT. How is that impacting the fight for educational equity with people wanting to have, you know, white discomfort bills, and let's not talk about race, let's not talk about anything that causes discomfort. So I say also, and then how should teachers respond? I mean, you have a teacher in a classroom who's like, you know, just teaching the history as he or she sees it and is now being told, well, don't teach that part or don't teach it that way. How should teachers respond to this debate on critical race theory? And is it taking us backwards? I seem to think it's taking us backwards.
It is. Go ahead. Go ahead. You can go ahead if you want to.
I was just going to mention like critical. So I did my dissertation looking at parents and parents in educational spaces through critical race theory. And I think what critical race theory did was it provided an outlet to look at an issue in a way that it was balanced, and that it provided an opportunity for my participants to be able to narrate their own stories in their own ways. That was a really healing piece for me, and also for my participants, to the point that my participants, and they were not my participants, they were actually co-participants. They mentioned that this was the first time that an educator had asked them about their role in education. So I just wanted to mention that it did provide a platform, maybe that it is a little bit different from what we're used to, but it provided a great platform for them to be able to tell their own stories, in the way that you guys were alluding to, Frere, that I can think now. I have the opportunity to think on my own terms, right? Because no one else is doing it for me. So I think I'm going to leave it at that, and I'm going to give Dr. Simmons the opportunity to answer that.
Thank you, Dr. Ramírez. I think it goes back to the first discussion that we started on tonight, and that is freedom. There's not any freedom. There's freedom for one group, but not another, which goes to Dr. Ramírez's discussions of a sense of belonging. Critical race theory is not even taught in K-12. If you research and go back, it is actually more of a law class, and people and students have an option to take critical race. So I really think there's I don't want to say, but it's almost a coward way of suppressing students that when you talk about the social and emotional piece of students were hurting when they saw George Floyd, what happened to him. That doesn't mean that you want any race to feel bad about what was done, but there needs to be an awareness of how students feel. And if students can't come to school and discuss how they feel, then you are taking away their freedom. Even when it comes to certain books that students like, we want students to read, but it's their choice of what they read in a media center. And now students don't have that right. Teachers don't have that right. And even though they have options to opt out of reading certain books. And so it goes back to freedom, and it goes back to suppressing others of a different race. And it doesn't matter if it's Hispanic race, Hmong race, African-American race. Students should feel comfortable in discussing how they feel, or picking up a book, or learning about different things that happened in the past, such as Emmett Till, such as the Tuskegee Institute. I'm trying to think about it. The immunization experiment. Thank you. The experiment, and we're on COVID. We're on the pandemic, and certain, now you have an epidemic where some Black males will not take a vaccination due to the Tuskegee experiment. And so had they been taught about that information in a K-12 setting, maybe it wouldn't be as difficult to make a choice of a vaccination. Now, I'm not saying everyone should get vaccinated. It is totally your choice before the comments start coming in, but it's just the history of all, not just African-Americans, but Hispanics among we are a United States of America, meaning there is more than one race in America. So therefore, students should have the opportunity to learn about true history and not just parts of history, so that it will not repeat itself. Because I think Dr. Carroll said that it's like we're moving backwards. Well, in order to move forward, we need to get an understanding of what was done and why we shouldn't repeat it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I think that's a segue into just, you know, what we're going to talk about next week. And we're going to have Dr. Kim Price, who is an associate professor of public health. And she's going to examine inequity in the healthcare system, including issues of access and diversity, just kind of linking to the not wanting to get vaccinated and education and all of that. So I just want to thank all of you all for joining us, Dr. Simmons, Dr. Ramírez, Dr. Mckesson, for a great conversation. It is 7:01, and so we are going to say goodbye for the evening. Thank you to everyone who has come, and we will see you next week.